The United States and Europe are fighting over cheese. Cheesemakers from Switzerland and France took American cheesemakers to court to try to stop them using the name Gruyere for cheese made in America. A Virginia court ruled against the French and Swiss cheesemakers in December 2021. They appealed and lost that appeal in March 2023. Despite these setbacks, they're planning to continue fighting to protect the name of their cheese in the US. But why is this legal battle even happening? Why should European cheesemakers care what Americans call their cheese? Hey there, cheese historians, I'm Julia and this is Cheese History, a channel where we talk about the history of cheese in all its weird and wonderfulness. In order to understand why America and Europe are fighting over Gruyere, it's important to understand why European cheesemakers feel they need to protect their cheese's names. Europe has a long history of cheesemaking, with different regions and countries being known for different styles of cheese. For example, today France is known mainly for its white and blue mold cheeses. A particular town or area might become known for its unique style of cheese, so many cheeses ended up being named after the towns they were made in or the markets where they were sold, such as Cheddar, Gouda, Gruyere, Camembert and Roquefort. Each cheese was often made by many cheesemakers in the area rather than just one. As the centuries passed and transportation improved from the horse and cart to trains and refrigerated ships, it was easier to ship cheese to countries further away, and some cheeses became very popular. As the cheese gained in popularity and reputation, other cheesemakers would try to ride the wave of success by making a similar cheese and marketing it using a well-known name. Camembert is a great example of this, as it rocketed to popularity in the early 19th century and was soon being made all over France and other countries in Europe, not just in its homeland of Normandy. These other cheesemakers weren't always as concerned about the quality of their cheese as they were about the quantity they could produce. They banked on the fact that the consumer would think they were buying the genuine article, but for a much cheaper price. But many people buying cheese wanted the genuine article, and traditional cheesemakers didn't want to go out of business. So a solution had to be found that could guarantee that the label on a cheese reflected the cheese itself, while also allowing many cheesemakers in a particular area to make that cheese. So what was that solution? It was a system for regulating either the geographical origins of a product, called a protected geographical indication, or one that could protect both the origins and how it was made, a protected designation of origin. Such a system was developed in France because of wine, something France is well known for today. But at the end of the 19th century, the reputation of French wine wasn't so good, because since the 1860s, a tiny aphid from North Africa had been destroying their grapevines, resulting in a grape shortfall, so many winemakers were adding water to their wine to make it go further. In 1919, France set up a system of appellation d'origine, or AO, to regulate the origins of its many wines. Only wine made in a certain area could use certain names. For example, only wine made around Champagne could be called Champagne. By 1925, other food products were included, and the first cheese, Roquefort, gained protection under appellation d'origine. But it wasn't enough to just control where something was made. Many wines and cheeses also need how they are made to be regulated to ensure high quality. In 1935, France expanded its system of appellation d'origine to appellation d'origine contrôlée, also known as AOC, to include stricter regulations for how a product is made. For cheese, these regulations could include the type of milk a cheese is made of, whether it's raw, pasteurized, or microfiltered, what equipment is used to make the cheese, what size it has to be, and how it's aged and packaged for selling. Basically, it can cover any part of the process from the animals making the milk right up to sending the finished cheese off to be sold. France's AOC system became the basis of the European Union's protected geographical indications and protected designation of origin. Both restrict the making of a product to a geographical area, but a protected designation of origin also specifies how it has to be made in a lot more detail. Over 200 different cheeses from all over Europe currently have protected designation of origin or protected geographical indication status. But what about Switzerland? Switzerland has a similar system to the European Union. It has both PDO and PGI, but calls them by French names, Appellation d'origine protégée and Indication géographique protégée. So where does Gruyere cheese fit into these systems? Gruyere has historically been made in the southern parts of the Alps and sold in the market town of Gruyere, which is in modern-day Switzerland. Now, because of history and politics and a whole bunch of different reasons, the borders of France and Switzerland didn't always look like they do today. So the area where Gruyere has been made for around the last 1,000 years is now partially in France and partially in Switzerland. So both countries claim the right to make this cheese, and both have some sort of protected status. Gruyere isn't the same in France and Switzerland, so the two countries also have to distinguish between the two. The difference between France and Switzerland's regulations can also help illustrate the difference between PDO and PGI. France's Gruyere has PGI status, so the restrictions include where in France it can be made, as well as some restrictions on how it's made, including only being made from cow's milk, what the cows are fed, how soon the cheese is made after milking, and what sort of bacterial culture has to be added. The end product also has to have a particular appearance and characteristics, including holes throughout between the size of a pea and a cherry. In Switzerland, Gruyere has PDO status, so every step of the process is controlled, from the exact diet of the cows to how far away from the cheese dairy the milk can come, how often during the day Gruyere can be made, and every step of the cheese making and aging process. The final cheese can only have tiny holes of a few millimeters and has to go through several rounds of quality control. Hopefully you can see that the Swiss PDO is much stricter than the French PGI. There is room for difference between producers in the Swiss regulations, but nowhere near as much as for French Gruyere. The two countries also have an agreement. France recognises Swiss cheesemakers' rights to make Le Gruyere, and Switzerland lets French cheesemakers call their cheese Gruyere as long as it's clearly labelled as being from France. So everyone is happy, as long as each sticks to their own regulations and doesn't try to claim they're making each other's cheese. So where does America come into all this? Why is there a court battle in Virginia over the use of the name Gruyere? Unlike the EU and Switzerland, America doesn't have any geographical limitations for Gruyere. Basically anyone can make it as long as they follow the steps outlined in the FDA's regulations and the final cheese has certain characteristics, such as holes. If an American cheesemaker wants to protect their product and stop anyone else from using a particular name, then they can apply for protection by getting a trademark through the US trademark system. A trademark recognises their right to use a specific name for their cheese and stops anyone else from being able to use that name, but it doesn't define anything else about the product, so it's very different from a PDO or PGI. The French-Swiss agreement over Gruyere works because both countries agree that Gruyere should be made in particular areas and in particular ways. But what happens when a country doesn't agree to this? Say, for example, American cheesemakers are making and selling cheese they call Gruyere. What happens then? Then the parties go to court to sort it out. The court battle in Virginia between American cheesemakers and European cheesemakers was over a geographical trademark, what's called a certification mark. America uses certification marks granted through the United States Patent and Trademark Office to protect the geographical origins of a product. They're kind of different from trademarks, which protect a particular name or logo, because they also require a product to be made in a certain way or in a particular area. The European cheesemakers wanted a certification mark for Gruyere, so that only cheese made according to the EU PGI or the Swiss PDO could be called Gruyere. Swiss Gruyere already has a certification mark in America, meaning that only Gruyere that originates in specified parts of Switzerland can use the name La Gruyere Switzerland AOC. It doesn't protect the name Gruyere though, which is what the Virginia court battle is about. A bunch of American cheesemakers objected to the Europeans getting a certification mark because it would obviously mean that they couldn't sell any cheese called Gruyere and would have to call it something else that American consumers wouldn't recognize. They argued that Gruyere was a generic term and that American consumers didn't think Gruyere came from France and Switzerland, but rather they saw Gruyere as a cheese with lots of holes in it that had a particular flavor and texture. They were able to use this type of argument because of the TRIPS agreement, an international trade agreement signed by 117 countries in 1994, including France, Switzerland, and America. It contained an exception that if a product's name had come to describe a type of product rather than where it came from, it could be considered generic and wouldn't be able to get protection. So in December 2021, a Virginia judge hearing the case for and against granting Gruyere a certification mark ruled that, in America, Gruyere was a generic term that had lost its geographical meaning to the American consumer. This decision was confirmed in March 2023 after the European cheesemakers appealed the initial decision. They aren't giving up though, vowing to appeal the appeal and keep fighting for their certification mark for Gruyere. And that's basically why there's a legal battle in America over the name Gruyere. Because French and Swiss cheesemakers want to stop American cheesemakers calling their cheese Gruyere because it isn't made in specific parts of France and Switzerland following the appropriate regulations. So do you think the Virginia judge made the right decision, or should France and Switzerland be able to stop American cheesemakers calling their cheese Gruyere? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for more cheese history.